as he prepares to do that. We're going to read some scripture together. Easy one to find, Genesis chapter 1. So we're going to start in Genesis chapter 1. I'm going to read the first couple of verses and then do a very quick abridged version of the rest of the chapter, and then Callie will read a little bit of chapter 2, just in the interests of time. So Genesis 1, verse 1, and this is a version you may not be familiar with. It's the New Revised Standard Version, updated edition. When God began to create the heavens and the earth was complete chaos, and the darkness covered the face of the deep, while a wind from God swept over the face of the waters. And then the rest of chapter 1 goes on to describe the coming of light, day and night, and the rest of the creation story. So just in the interest of time, we're not going to go into all of that, just focus in on the first 2 verses. But Callie, do you want to read chapter 2?
So Genesis 2, starting at verse 1. Thus the heavens and the earth were finished in all their multitude. On the 6th day, God finished the work that he had done, and he rested on the 7th day from all the work that he had done. So God blessed the 7th day and hallowed it, because on it God rested from all the work that he had done in creation.
Excellent. Thank you. The hare and the tortoise. A hare was making fun of the tortoise one day for being slow. "Do you ever get anywhere?" he asked with a mocking laugh. "Yes," replied the tortoise, "and I get there sooner than you think. I'll run you a race and prove it." The hare was much amused at the idea of running a race with the tortoise, but for the fun of the thing, he agreed. So the fox, who had consented to act as a judge, marked the distance and started the runners off. The hare was soon far out of sight, and to make the tortoise feel very deeply how ridiculous it was for him to try and race with a hare, he laid down by the side of the course to take a nap until the tortoise should catch up. The tortoise, meanwhile, kept going slowly but steadily, and after a time passed the place where the hare was sleeping. But the hare slept on very peacefully, and when at last he did wake up, the tortoise was near the goal. The hare now ran his swiftest, but he could not overtake the tortoise in time. The race is not always to the swift. I remember having a book of Aesop's fables as a young lad. Most of them I've forgotten, these stories, but this story I absolutely remember. And it shaped my life, partly because I identify with being the hare. I'm good at starting things, not so good at finishing. Just ask Pippa. Aesop's fables are a collection of stories credited to somebody called Aesop, who was a slave, a storyteller. He lived in ancient Greece about 600 years before the time of Christ. And these fables are still told today, shaping the imagination of people who read them. Now, of course, when you read a story like The Hare and the Tortoise, you don't actually believe that there was a hare and a tortoise. It's not historical, but it is profoundly true. And it tells the truth about patience and pride and perseverance in a way that facts never could. It tells a story about what really matters. When we were talking about this, Andrew Strutzenberg said, I'd really love you, Rupert, to share a little bit about why this text and some of the stories share personally. So I'm going to take you literally here, Andrew, and share very personally today some of the stories that shape me and why these texts reshape my imagination in different ways. So family stories, I think, operate in a very similar way. My parents were born just before the Second World War. They grew up as young people at a time of scarcity, of rationing. And I remember being a young boy living at home, and actually even beyond that into my adulthood, of my mum telling me what bargains that she had managed to get on her weekly shop. The amazing deals that she had managed to find. And these stories told again and again and again have shaped my imagination. What to fear, what to value, what to hold on to. Shaped a mindset that perhaps has been shaped more by scarcity than abundance. Until I got married to someone who had different family stories and realized that we didn't think the same way about things and stuff and bargains. Stories that shape us as individuals also shape us as communities. So we're embarking on a series that we've entitled Stories That Shape Us. We came up with this, well, actually, I didn't come up with this. I had a phone call that I took in the middle of a leadership team meeting, came back 5 minutes later, and everybody else had decided on this sermon series title. Stories That Shape Us. I loved it. And then the Genesis texts, we're going to be looking at Genesis 1 to 4, came a little bit later. And this might even become a series of series. Stories that shape us. We might think about Genesis and then other of these kind of key stories that make up this big story of God that we read in Scripture. So we may, over the coming years, look at Exodus and exile and gospel. And then a few people have said, are we ever going to speak on Revelation? I'd love to hear you on Revelation, Rupert. I'm like, I'm never going to speak on Revelation, but we might do endings as well. And this big story of God, it may be something that we do. And this is one of the most important things I think I'm going to say today. Most of us assume that what shapes our lives most deeply is our beliefs. The things that we think are true. But psychologists, philosophers, and theologians have noticed something else. That we're shaped first not by what we believe, but we're shaped by the stories that we live inside. Stories don't tell us just what to think, they train us how to see. They shape our imagination long before they shape our opinions. They teach us what kind of world we live in, what kind of people we are, and what kind of future is possible. You can't change somebody's beliefs without touching their imagination. When a story changes our imagination, then the beliefs will often follow later on. That's why arguments rarely transform people. But stories do. And that's why the Bible doesn't start with a list of doctrines, but it starts with a story. I think that's genius. I'll say a bit more about that in a moment. So I want to think a little bit about how do we read these texts. And I want to try and navigate my way through this very carefully. So please listen out for a caveat that I'm going to make about halfway through this section. This story has always captured my imagination. I love the poetry that we didn't have time to read today. Please go and read it. The richness of the language and the imagery. I love the way that it takes me in my mind and my imagination to imagine this story. I love the puzzles that are in this story that invite exploration, and I keep going back to it. Leslie Helfer last year recommended reading, and I think started a growth group listening to the Beamer podcast. It's absolutely brilliant on these texts, particularly the early texts of Genesis. And it's full of these puzzles that are there for us to explore and wrestle with. And I love these stories because of the seeds that are sown right at the beginning of the Bible that then begin to, as you read, they germinate and they spring up in different places. And you see the echoes of this Genesis story coming to its fulfillment, and even right at the endings in Revelation. These stories tell a story that shapes and forms me, not in the way of my family or the culture or even sometimes the church, but in the way of Jesus. I absolutely love these chapters. These are some of my favorite scriptures. And if you've been around this church any length of time, you'll know that I keep coming back to some of these stories that shape us. And so we're going to dwell in these texts over the next 10 weeks. But these chapters have also been used and have been subject to much angst and dispute and debate, particularly about how they're to be read. And they've sometimes been read in really harmful and hurtful ways. I hope if you've been part of our church for a while, you haven't experienced that here. But if you go online at all, or you're part of maybe other churches, you'll have come across these texts being read in particular ways, sometimes quite harmful or hurtful ways. And if that's the case, I'm sorry. And our hope is in this series that we can tell a better story, a more beautiful story, a more compelling, larger, amazing story of beauty and joy and healing and restoration through these texts, because I think that's what this is really about. One of the challenges about this text is that sometimes people have insisted that you have to read them in a specific way. To be a faithful Christian, to respect Scripture or to take Scripture as authoritative, you have to read them in a historical way, describing what's happened. Now, I'm going to come to a caveat in a moment, but it is that insistence on reading them in a particular way that I think has been so helpful. And that was certainly, so unhelpful. Unhelpful. That insistence that these are historical documents describing what happened, and you have to read them in that particular way to be a faithful Bible reader. I think that's been profoundly unhelpful. And that was certainly my impression when, as a young Christian, I first came to this church 37 years ago. And the problem is I've never read the text in these ways. So I kept quiet. I didn't say anything for a very long time about how I did read these texts, because there was this pressure to be included. You needed to read them in a particular way. The danger or the fear of exclusion or dismissal if you didn't read them in the way that was assumed was the faithful, authoritative way of reading these texts. So I just kept quiet. I've spoken to loads of people about this privately, but I've never spoken publicly about how to read these texts. I remember sitting on a bench with Malcolm up on Braids Hill, I think it was, and And Malcolm said, I think this was a few years ago, probably 2, 3, 4 years ago, and we were talking about science and da-da-da-da. Malcolm said, I'd love to hear you speak about these texts publicly. And I said, I'm not going to do that. It's too contentious, too difficult. I don't want to stir up conflict. Well, today's the day. And I want to tell a couple of stories of my journey in being more confident about sharing my beliefs about the kinds of stories these are. But first, let me pause and come to that caveat. And I want to say something very carefully and something really important. There is a danger, a possibility, that those who do read these texts in a historical way, that you might hear me today dismissing your perspective. My commitment is to the very best of my ability not to do that. The problem, I think, has been an insistence that there is one only faithful reading of this scripture. And if you read the text in a historical way, I don't want to dismiss your interpretation. If that works for you, and you find that a helpful way of reading scripture, then I am really glad. And I don't want to today to persuade you to read them differently. But I do want to tell a couple of stories about why I think this is important for some people to hear a different way of reading those texts. Because reading the text historically has never worked for me, and it doesn't work for some other people as well. So the stories. I remember as I joined this church and felt this pressure to keep silent with my views that didn't conform to what I perceived as the normal way of reading these scriptures, there became an increasing sense of dissonance that was within me, of my personal theology and understanding, and the culture and the expectations of the church as I experienced it at the time. I would think this is probably coming up to 30 years ago. And I remember being in a car with Colin Symes. And Colin was one of my safe people. And I can tell you, I can picture where, my memory's not brilliant, but I can picture where it was, because this was an incredibly significant moment. And I had the courage to say to somebody in this church for the first time that I didn't believe that Adam and Eve were historical characters. I believed it was a brilliant story, but not historical. I was worried that I would be mocked or ridiculed or excluded or dismissed. And Colin, bless his heart, I can't remember the exact words that he said, but I absolutely remember the feeling. I remember the feeling of being validated, that this was a faithful way of reading Scripture. I don't know whether he agreed with me or not. I don't know to this day. But I remember that feeling that it was okay to express my questions and my doubts, and that was all right. And that story has absolutely shaped me. And it's part of my commitment that no question and no doubt, no concern that we have or different way of reading the scripts ought to be dismissed or unvalidated, because it leads to this internal dissonance that is profoundly destructive. The second story happened much more recently. It was a young man who grew up in this church. I won't name his name. And he'd grown up with a reading of these scriptures that was literal, historical, that it was describing what happened, with what's sometimes called young earth creationism. And he'd gone to university. And he'd heard different stories. He'd come across different opinions. He was doing a science degree. He'd come across scientists, most of whom believed different things to that. And he described how this particular issue was the catalyst for him walking away from his faith. It was the single most important thing that meant that he could no longer believe. I remember saying to him, you do know that there are many, many Christians, probably most Christians around the world, that don't believe that's the only way of reading the text, that there are other faithful ways of reading these texts. You can read it like this. But the moment had gone, the decision had been made, and he walked away. And that story is part of my commitment to talk honestly about these things. This is why this is really important to me. And it's led me to be more confident about saying how I read these texts in the hope that it helps people who struggle with how to interpret them. So I believe that these stories aren't history. They aren't describing what happened in a literal way. Now, please hear me very carefully when I say this. When I say that they're not history, I don't mean that they're not true. They're profoundly true in a way that parables or fables can speak deeply into our lives and our experiences. When I'm talking privately to people, this is often the way that I explain it. Think about the parables that Jesus tells. My favorite parable that I keep going back to again and again and again because it profoundly speaks to the deepest parts of who I am, is the parable of the lost sons. It's one of the most truthful stories that's ever been told about humanity and about forgiveness and about who God is and about who I am as a human being. And yet it didn't actually happen. It's a parable. No one hears the parable and says, well, which village did this happen in? They hear the parable and they ask, which brother am I? Who do I most identify with? So while I don't read these texts in Genesis as historical, I do think they're profoundly true. Some of the truest things that have ever been written about the world in which we live. And these stories are origin stories. It's stories about beginnings. Genesis means beginnings. And they shape the direction of the story in the rest of Scripture and how it unfolds. But I don't believe that this is a story about the beginnings of the cosmos. It's about the story of the beginnings of the people of God. It's describing who our God is. Don't do this to me. It describes what kind of world this is and the kind of people that we are meant to be. And the genius of this story is the poetry and the story that is told. And I think this is utter genius. Because stories transcend cultures and they transcend time. They speak to people in lots of different contexts about our beginnings as the people of God. It had to work for the Jewish people several centuries before Christ, as they wrestled with their identity and their purpose. It has to work for us, 2,000 odd years later, in our context, with all the technological and scientific advancements that there's been over those period of time. And it might still need to work in 1,000, 2,000, 5,000 years' time in whatever the world looks like at that particular moment. Stories can transcend culture and transcend time and still speak to people profoundly about the beginnings. These stories probably have their origins around campfire. Campfires as people just told these stories as part of the oral tradition in families and maybe in worship in ancient Israel. It was passed on from one generation to another generation. And then these stories were gradually written down, and they're as fragments of stories, and different traditions probably emerged. But the crucial moment for the formation of these stories that we read about in Genesis is almost certainly the exile. I wonder if you were expecting that. And this changes how we hear and read and understand these stories. Now, the exile was when Jerusalem was destroyed and many Israelites were taken to Babylon. And it was a moment of deep, profound communal trauma and disorientation. And this provoked questions of identity. Who are we? Is God defeated, or is he still in control? Is the world chaotic and hostile? Do we still belong to God? And in that time when they were in Babylon, they would have come across creation stories of other nations. And these creation stories from other nations, particularly the Babylonian creation stories, shaped the identity of what it meant to be Babylonian. And the Babylonian and other creation stories of the cultures around told very different stories to the one that we read in Genesis. Creation emerged from conflict of gods fighting one another. Violence was at the heart of reality. And human beings were created to serve and be subservient to the gods. Those were the stories that they would have come across in this captivity and slavery in exile in Babylon. And so these oral and written traditions began to be compiled and shaped and edited and brought together as a deliberate contrast to the creation stories of the foreign nations in which they were living. This means that Genesis was written from a place of chaos, loss, and uncertainty, and it's deliberately telling a different story. Genesis is primarily a story that says, this is who we are. This is the world in which we live. And this, and most importantly, and this is who our God is. Now, you might think this is all a little bit of nerdy, Bible, theology kind of stuff, but this is how it lands for us. Genesis is a story that offers a counter story about human flourishing to the other stories that we are told within our families, within our culture, and sometimes, sadly, even in our churches. Genesis is this counter story that forms us and creates an imagination of this is who we are in the midst of the chaos and the uncertainty and the anxiety in which we live. So let's just very briefly look at two verses here the text of Genesis 1 and how it starts. We read from the NRSV updated edition. You may not have come across it. NRSV is a well-established Bible translation, and I think this most helpfully draws out what these opening verses are trying to say. When God began to create the heavens and the earth was complete chaos, and darkness covered the face of the deep, while a wind from God swept over the face of the waters. Now, different translations lean in different ways, but they all allow for this reading that the story begins not with God creating the chaos, but with God entering the chaos. It moves away from origins of the cosmos to a story about who God is. A God who enters chaos and darkness and mess and brings beauty and life and flourishing and order right from the beginning. We learn something profound about who God is. This is a God who enters what is. The reality of the circumstances, the formlessness, the emptiness, the messiness, the chaos, and he works within that space to bring abundance, beauty, flourishing. And this matters. This matters to me, this matters to us, because there's much of our lives that's characterized by chaos and messiness and anxiety, just like those who collated these stories in exile in Babylon. We can probably recognize aspects of that messiness and chaos and uncertainty in our own lives, in our families, or in the news that we read. Gosh, even this week, right? That shooting was in your hometown, Andrew and Callie, wasn't it? From ICE. I mean, gosh, these stories speak of a world that is chaotic, full of darkness, full of evil. And God, the story in Genesis, describes God entering into these spaces to bring beauty, to untangle the messes, to bring healing, to bring life, to bring flourishing. God's not concerned about entering into these spaces. He's always at work, always seeking to bring beauty out of ashes, untangling the messes, healing our diseases, healing our sicknesses and sins. This Genesis story tells us that this is a God who brings light where there's darkness, who brings life where there is emptiness, flourishing where there is formlessness and bleakness, order where there's chaos, abundance where there is scarcity. This story of Genesis begins to undo the stories that I was formed with, from parents who grew up with rationing. This story can reform my imagination to tell of a world that is different to what I was told by stories as I was growing up. This is a story that whispers hope, that chaos is not the end of the story. And God creates human beings not born to be subservient, exploited, or controlled, but as a joyful expression of the love of God. He's created you and I as a joyful expression of his love. Wow. Created for relationship and community with God and with one another. Not as servants, but to participate in the ongoing work of bringing beauty from chaos. So this is where the Genesis story can shape us and challenge the stories that we've received elsewhere. Stories of violence and power and control and coercion. Because at its heart, Genesis offers a different vision of reality. This story can inspire our imaginations, shape our lives, that we can look for beauty in the midst of the mess and the chaos of the world around us, joy in the midst of despair. We can trust God in the midst of the world in which we live and the lives and what we are experiencing. We can resist violent and fear-based stories in our world. And gosh, are they not absolutely prevalent? That we are a people shaped by God, called to flourish, participating with God. We are his joy and his delight. Now that, my friends, is a story that I want to live out of. And I think it's a story that we need to be reminded of again and again and again. Because there's so many other stories out there that we hear all the time that are telling a different story. And this, I hope, as I've offered this today, is a story that we can find compelling and inspiring. Thank you for listening. I wonder if the band could just come up, and let's just pause for a moment. And let's just take a few minutes. If you're feeling a bit nippy and you want to stand up, please do. Go and stand by a radiator, or just even stand up and get some blood circulating.